A shipwreck. Everything lost. A lifetime's fortune sinking into the Mediterranean along with the wreckage of the ship. Most men would fall into despair. Zeno of Citium did something different. He smiled. Because in that moment, losing everything he owned, he discovered something no one could take from him, the philosophy that would change the Western world forever. But who was this man who transformed a personal tragedy into the foundation of Stoicism? And why does his response to ruin still echo 2,300 years later, teaching millions of people the art of resilience? To understand Zeno, we need to go back to the 4th century before Christ, a time when the Greek world was falling apart. Alexander the Great had died too young, leaving an empire with no clear heir. His conquests fragmented into rival kingdoms commanded by ambitious generals. Cities that once lived under the protection of Athens or Sparta now found themselves at the mercy of foreign dynasties, constant wars, and brutal political instability. It was the so-called Hellenistic period, a time of intense cultural expansion, but also of profound existential anxiety. The old certainties of the Greek polis, that political community where the citizen found his purpose and identity, were crumbling. The individual found himself increasingly alone in a vast, unpredictable, and often hostile world. In this scenario, new philosophical questions arise. How to live well when everything around you seems out of control? How to find inner peace amid external chaos? Where to seek meaning when traditional structures no longer offer answers? It's into this world that Zeno is born, around 334 BC in the city of Citium, present-day Larnaca, Cyprus. It wasn't Athens. It wasn't the heart of classical Greek civilization. It was a Hellenized Phoenician colony, a bustling commercial port where cultures mingled. Greeks, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Persians. Zeno came from a family of merchants. His father was a trader, and young Zeno grew up destined to follow the family business. He learned early to deal with numbers, maritime routes, stocks of Tyrian purple, that precious dye extracted from mollusks that was worth its weight in gold. But fate, or fortune as the Greeks would say, had other plans. Zeno wasn't born a philosopher. He was born a merchant, and for years he lived exactly as expected of him, trading, traveling, accumulating wealth. Historical sources diverge on the exact details, but converge on one essential point. Around the age of 30, Zeno was transporting a valuable cargo of Tyrian purple when his ship was wrecked near the coast of Attica. Some versions say it was near Piraeus, the port of Athens. Others suggest the storm caught him on the high seas. What matters is this: in a single day, everything was gone. Decades of work, the family fortune, future plans, all devoured by the Mediterranean. Zeno arrived in Athens wet, exhausted, and ruined. But here's the fascinating detail, something that reveals the man's character even before he became a philosopher. Instead of lamenting or rushing back to Citium to restart the business, Zeno did something unexpected. He walked into a bookshop, or rather, a bibliopole, a shop where hand-copied papyrus scrolls were sold, extremely expensive and rare. He was there, penniless but curious, when he asked the seller for something to read. The bookseller handed him a text about Socrates, possibly part of Xenophon's Memorabilia, or perhaps a Platonic dialogue. Zeno read, and something clicked. Here was a man, Socrates, who had faced death with total serenity, who possessed no wealth but radiated wisdom, who didn't control the external world but completely mastered his inner world, who had been unjustly condemned and yet refused to flee or betray his principles. Zeno looked up from the papyrus and asked a question that would change his life. Where can I find men like this? The bookseller pointed outside the shop. At that exact moment, the cynic philosopher Crates of Thebes was passing by on the street. "Follow that man," said the seller. And Zeno followed. Crates was a disciple of the Cynic school, founded by Diogenes of Sinope, the the one who lived in a barrel, spat in the faces of the powerful, and carried a lantern in broad daylight saying he was looking for an honest man. The Cynics preached radical detachment from material goods, social conventions, and others' opinions. They lived like street dogs. Cynic comes from kynikos, meaning canine, rejecting everything society considered important. For a newly ruined merchant, this philosophy had obvious appeal. If you've lost everything, why not embrace the idea that possessing things was never important? Zeno became Crates' disciple. For years he studied with him, learning to despise luxury, to endure privations, to question conventional values. There are accounts of Crates testing him publicly. Once he ordered Zeno to carry a pot of lentils through the Athenian agora. Zeno, still embarrassed by public attention, tried to hide his face. Crates broke the pot with his walking stick, letting the broth run down Zeno's legs while passers-by laughed. "Why do you flee, little Phoenician?" Crates taunted. "Nothing terrible has happened to you." The lesson was clear. Shame only exists if you value others' opinions. But Zeno was too observant, too intelligent to content himself with a single school of thought. He attended other masters. He studied with Stilpo of Megara, a specialist in logic and dialectic. He learned from Polemon at the Platonic Academy, absorbing concepts about virtue, cosmic order, and ethics. He spent time with the Xenocrates and other successors of Plato. Each master offered him a piece of the puzzle. From the Cynics, he learned self-sufficiency and detachment. From the Megarians, logical precision and argumentative rigor. From the academics, the vision of a rationally ordered universe and virtue as the supreme good. For 20 years, Zeno studied, absorbed, questioned. He wasn't just an obedient disciple. He was a brilliant synthesizer. He saw where each school erred. The Cynics were admirable in their endurance, but they exaggerated their contempt for society and culture. The academics were right about virtue, but got lost in metaphysical speculations distant from practical life. The Megarians were sharp in logic, but too cold in ethical application. Zeno began to realize it was possible to create something new, a philosophy that would take the best of each tradition and build a coherent, practical, powerful system. But for that, he would need courage. Courage to disagree with his masters, courage to found his own school, courage to face the relentless scrutiny of Athenian philosophers who protected their traditions with ferocity. At 50 years old, an advanced age for someone who had not yet established his own legacy, Zeno finally took the decisive step. He began to teach. Rise Zeno had no money to rent a space. He didn't possess a garden like Epicurus, who at the same time was teaching his disciples in a private retreat closed to strangers. He had no access to Plato's academy, already established for decades with its own tradition and property. So he did what philosophers without resources did. He taught in public. He chose the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, a covered colonnade on the north side of the Athenian agora. It was a busy place, decorated with famous frescoes depicting historical battles, the fight against the Amazons, the fall of Troy, the Greek victory at Marathon. Merchants passed through there, citizens gathered to talk. It was a democratic space, open, with no barriers to entry, and it was free. This choice said everything about the philosophy Zeno was building. While Epicurus isolated himself with his chosen followers, preaching withdrawal from public life, Zeno planted his school in the heart of the city, accessible to anyone willing to listen. At first, few paid attention. A middle-aged Phoenician talking about virtue and nature wasn't exactly news in Athens. The city teemed with philosophers proclaiming they'd discovered the secret to the good life. But Zeno was different. First, there was his physical presence. Ancient sources describe a lean man with dark skin burned by the Mediterranean sun, a slightly crooked neck since childhood, an austere but not slovenly appearance. He didn't seek to shock as the Cynics did. He didn't walk around in rags or dirty. He dressed with simplicity, but dignity. He ate little, drank only water, avoided excesses of any kind. Second, there was his irreproachable ethical posture. In a philosophical world full of charlatanism, sophists who charged fortunes, masters who promised instant happiness, thinkers who contradicted in private life everything they preached in public, Zeno was radically consistent. He lived exactly as he taught. It's told that once a young disciple was talking too much during a discussion. Zeno remained silent, listening patiently. When the boy finally asked why the master wasn't saying anything, Zeno replied, "Nature gave us 2 ears and only 1 mouth. Perhaps we should listen twice as much as we speak." Another story relates that a wealthy man offered Zeno a large sum of money to dedicate a philosophical treatise to his son. Zeno politely refused, saying, "The best dedication I can make to your son is not to write his name in a book, but to teach him to live virtuously. That cannot be bought." These stories circulated. Athens was a small city, about 30,000 free citizens, where reputations were built or destroyed quickly. And Zeno's reputation began to grow. Here was a philosopher who truly believed what he said. Third, and perhaps most important, there was the content of his teaching. Zeno was proposing something revolutionary, a practical philosophy of resilience based on a rational understanding of the universe. He began with a physical premise. The cosmos, Zeno said, is not chaotic. It's rationally ordered. There exists a logos, a divine reason, an intelligence permeating all reality. Later Stoics would call this God, but not in the sense of an old bearded man sitting in the clouds. The Stoic God is immanent. It's the very rationality of the universe, the order that keeps the planets in orbit, that makes the seed transform into a tree, that governs the succession of seasons. This rational universe has a crucial characteristic. It's deterministic. Everything happens by logical necessity, following causal chains that trace back to the origin of all things. What the Greeks called fate, haimarmene, is not divine caprice. It's the inevitable causal structure of reality. Here was the first pillar of Stoicism, rational acceptance of what is necessary. But, and this is a gigantic but, within this deterministic universe, there's one thing that remains free: your capacity to judge, to give or remove value from things, to choose your opinions and internal reactions. Zeno called this what depends on us versus what doesn't depend on us, the famous dichotomy of control that would become the heart of Stoicism. Doesn't depend on you. Wealth, health, reputation, others' behavior, natural disasters, the duration of your life. Depends on you, your judgments, your moral choices, your opinions about what is good or bad, your attitude toward events. Most people, Zeno said, live in the illusion that they control the uncontrollable. They spend their lives trying to guarantee wealth, avoid illness, manipulate others' opinions, prevent misfortunes. And when, inevitably, these things escape their control, they fall into despair. The Stoic solution is radical. Completely transfer your emotional investment from what you don't control to what you do control. Stop valuing wealth as good in itself. It's indifferent. Stop fearing illness as bad in itself. It's indifferent. The only genuinely good thing is virtue. Excellence of character, wisdom, justice, courage, self-control. And that depends entirely on you. Zeno illustrated this with a powerful example that would be repeated for centuries. Imagine a dog tied to a moving cart. The dog can resist, be dragged painfully, hurt itself fighting against the rope. Or it can run along with the cart, freely, at the same pace. In both cases, it goes where the cart goes. That's determined. But the experience, the suffering or freedom, depends on its choice. So it is with the Stoic sage. He cannot prevent external things from happening, but he chooses to accompany them rationally, without useless resistance, without disturbing passions. And here entered another central concept that Zeno developed with logical rigor: apatheia. The word scares modern ears. It sounds like apathy, cold indifference, absence of feelings. But that's not it. Apatheia literally means absence of passions, where passions, pathe, are destructive emotions based on false judgments about what is good or bad. Fear, it's erroneously judging that something bad is coming. Excessive desire, it's erroneously judging that something external will bring happiness. Anger, it's erroneously judging that someone has harmed you when, in fact, nothing external can harm your true rational nature. The Stoic sage is not an emotional robot. He can feel genuine joy, deep affection, intense motivation, what the Stoics called good emotions, eupatheiai. But these arise from correct judgments about what truly has value, not from irrational attachments. Zeno systematized all this with impressive logical elegance. He divided philosophy into three interdependent areas: logic, how to think correctly, how to distinguish valid arguments from fallacies, how to use reason to reach truth; physics, how the universe works, what its nature is, why things happen as they do; ethics, how to live, what to value, how to act virtuously in accordance with the rational nature of the cosmos. These three areas weren't separate. Zeno used an agricultural metaphor. Logic is the wall that protects the orchard, physics is the soil and trees, ethics is the fruit. You need all three to have a complete philosophical system. And this system was working. People began to listen, not just idealistic youth, but also merchants, soldiers, politicians, people who lived in the real world and needed practical tools to deal with real pressures. Zeno didn't promise easy happiness. He didn't offer tricks or shortcuts. He said, life is hard, the universe is indifferent to your expectations, you will lose things, you will suffer, you will die. But you can choose to be virtuous through all of it. And that choice, that excellence of character, is the only thing no one can take from you. It was a harsh message, but it was honest, and in a Hellenistic world marked by instability and anxiety, philosophical honesty had invaluable worth. Disciples began to multiply. Cleanthes of Assos, a former boxer who worked nights as a water carrier to pay for his studies, became a faithful follower. Aristo of Chios, Herylis of Carthage, Dionysius of Heraclea, brilliant thinkers from different parts of the Greek world gathered at the Stoa Poikile to debate with Zeno, and the name stuck. Zeno's followers came to be known not as Zenonians, but as Stoics, the ones of the porch, those who studied at the Stoa. Athens, which had already produced Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, now witnessed the birth of yet another great philosophical school. And this time, the founder wasn't an aristocratic Athenian, but a Phoenician merchant who had lost everything in a shipwreck and found something more valuable than any cargo of purple: a philosophy of unshakable resilience. But was Zeno himself as unshakable as he preached? Zeno taught resilience. He preached acceptance of fate. He argued that the sage remains tranquil in the face of any adversity. But was he himself this ideal sage, or just another philosopher, eloquent in theory and fragile in practice? Life took it upon itself to test his own doctrines. The first test came in the form of fierce criticism. Athens was an intellectual battlefield where philosophical reputations were attacked without mercy. Epicurus and his followers, on the other side of the city in their enclosed garden, represented a radically opposed worldview. While Zeno preached civic engagement, arduous virtue, and rational acceptance of the deterministic cosmos, Epicurus defended moderate pleasure, intimate friendship, withdrawal from politics, and a universe made of atoms falling randomly through the void. The Epicureans spared no criticism of the Stoics. They accused Zeno of promoting a hard and joyless life, of transforming humans into unfeeling stones, of preaching conformity in the face of injustice. "You say everything is determined," they mocked. "So why make an effort? Why practice virtue if there's no real choice?" Zeno responded with calm logic. "Determinism," he explained, "doesn't eliminate human agency. Our moral choices are part of the causal chain. The fact that something is determined doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Your decisions are part of fate, not separate from it. When you choose to act virtuously, that too is part of the rational order of the cosmos." But the attacks didn't come only from the Epicureans. Skeptical academics, especially under the leadership of Poikile, questioned the very possibility of certain knowledge. "If we can't be certain of anything," they said, "how can Zeno assert with such confidence that he knows the nature of the universe, or what constitutes virtue?" Zeno developed a sophisticated theory of knowledge to respond. He introduced the concept of cognitive representation, phantasia, cataleptika. Certain perceptions are so clear, so vivid, so coherent with our reason that we cannot help but accept them as true. It's like the difference between seeing something in dense fog and seeing it under direct sunlight. Truth imposes itself on the prepared, rational mind. Zeno even used a physical gesture to illustrate the process of knowledge. He extended his hand open to represent the initial sensory impression. Then he curved his fingers slightly to show assent to that impression. Then he closed his hand into a fist to represent firm comprehension. And finally he placed his other hand over the closed fist, squeezing tightly to show the unshakable scientific knowledge that only the sage possesses. These were intellectual battles. Zeno fought them with rigor and patience, but there were more intimate, more painful tests. He aged. The body, that same body he taught was indifferent to true well-being, began to fail. There are records that Zeno suffered from persistent pain. His legs, which had walked thousands of times to the Stoa Poikile, became heavy and painful. How do you preach detachment from the body when every step hurts? How do you teach that pain is indifferent when it wakes you every night? Zeno didn't deny the reality of pain. Stoicism was never about pretending physical suffering doesn't exist. It was about not letting it dictate your moral judgments, not allowing it to transform you into someone bitter, resentful, or cowardly. And there were losses. Disciples died. It was inevitable in an era when diseases killed without warning and wars claimed promising youth. Zeno lost people he loved. Because he did love, Stoicism allows love, allows deep friendship, allows human attachment. What it doesn't allow is letting loss destroy you, because you knew from the beginning that everything given can be taken away. There's a particularly moving account involving Zeno and one of his closest disciples. The young man contracted a serious illness. Zeno visited him daily, sat beside his bed, talked with him. When the disciple died, Zeno wept. Someone in the crowd mocked, "Look at the Stoic philosopher crying. Where is your apatheia now?" Zeno responded with dignity. Weeping for the loss of someone dear is not a vicious passion. It's naturally recognizing the value of a human being. What would be vicious would be to let myself be paralyzed by grief, to think the universe owes me his life, to fall into despair as if something contrary to nature had occurred. He died. That was always a possibility. My sadness acknowledges his importance. My acceptance acknowledges the order of the cosmos. It was a subtle but crucial line. Stoicism doesn't eliminate appropriate human emotions. It eliminates the destructive ones, those based on false judgments about what we can control. And then came the final test, the most revealing. Zeno was around 72 years old. One day, after finishing teaching at the Stoa Poikile, he was walking home when he stumbled. He fell and broke a toe, or perhaps a finger, sources diverge. But this is a minor detail. What matters is what happened next. Zeno was on the ground, looking at his own injured digit, and according to ancient accounts, he struck his hand on the ground and recited a verse from a Greek tragedy. I come, why do you call me? He was speaking to fate, to death, to the inevitable order of the universe. And then Zeno went home, refused food and drink, and died, apparently by his own choice, letting himself die of starvation over a few days. This caused shock in Athens. It caused debate among the Stoics themselves. It caused questions that echo to this day. Did Zeno commit suicide? Can a Stoic do this? Wouldn't that be going against nature, against the logos that governs life? The Stoic answer, developed later by his successors, was nuanced. Suicide out of despair, out of uncontrollable passion, out of rage against fate. That would be vicious, contrary to reason. But there are situations where life ceases to be in accordance with rational nature. Incurable illness that destroys the capacity to live virtuously. Extreme pain that prevents the use of reason. Or simply the recognition by a sage that his mission is complete and the appropriate moment has arrived. For Zeno, perhaps that stumble was a sign. He had taught for decades. He had firmly established his school. He had trained disciples capable of continuing the work. His body was beginning to fail seriously. And in that moment of falling, he saw clearly it was time. So he made the most stoic choice possible. He accepted fate's call without resistance, without fear, without regret. There's no record of a final formal lecture, no farewell speech, just the silent action of a man aligning himself completely with his own philosophy. Zeno died in 262 BC after living 72 years, of which at least 30 were dedicated to philosophy. Athens granted him extraordinary honors, a golden crown, a tomb in the Kerameikos district where the most illustrious citizens were buried. A public decree praised him not only for his philosophical wisdom, but for his exemplary life. Zeno of Citium, having lived in our city many years, showed himself good in all respects, especially because he encouraged virtue and temperance in the young men who came to him, offering his own life as an example. His own life as an example, that was the key. Zeno wasn't just the founder of Stoicism, he was its first living demonstration. Zeno's death could have been the end. After all, how many philosophical schools died along with their charismatic founders? How many brilliant teachings were lost because no one continued the work? But Stoicism was different. Zeno didn't build a personality cult. He built a system. And that system had its own legs to walk through the centuries. Cleanthes of Assos, that former boxer who worked as a water carrier to pay for his studies, assumed leadership of the school. He was almost the same age as Zeno when the master died, but would live another 19 years teaching at the Stoa Poikile. Cleanthes didn't have Zeno's systematic genius, but he had something equally valuable, an unshakable devotion to Stoic principles and a poetic ability to express them. It was Cleanthes who wrote the Hymn to Zeus, one of the few complete texts that survived from early ancient Stoicism. There, he poetically reformulated Zeno's ideas about the divine logos permeating the cosmos, about the rational order of the universe, about the necessity of aligning oneself with that order. Lead me, O Zeus, and you, Fate, wherever I am assigned. I will follow without hesitation, and even if, weakened, I refuse, I will have to follow anyway. This formulation would become famous, repeated by Stoics for centuries. It perfectly summarizes the Stoic attitude. I prefer to follow fate freely, but if I resist, I'll be dragged anyway. So why not choose the freedom of rational acceptance? But it was Cleanthes' successor who would truly transform Stoicism into the dominant philosophical force of the Hellenistic world. Chrysippus of Soli. Chrysippus was an absolutely obsessive logical genius. It was said in Athens that if there were no Chrysippus, there would be no Stoa, because he systematized, defended, and expanded Zeno's ideas with an argumentative rigor that made Stoicism practically invincible in philosophical debates. He wrote more than 700 treatises. 700. On logic, ethics, physics, rhetoric, epistemology. Most were lost. Cruel irony of history that only fragments quoted by later critics survived. But these fragments reveal a mind of devastating precision. Chrysippus refined Stoic propositional logic to the point of anticipating developments that would only be rediscovered in modern mathematical logic 2,000 years later. He developed arguments about causality and determinism with a subtlety that still impresses contemporary philosophers. He defended Stoicism from all criticisms, from skeptics, from Epicureans, from academics, with legendary intellectual tenacity. It's told that Chrysippus died laughing during a philosophical discussion, had an attack, and passed away right there, until the last second, doing what he loved. With Zeno, Cleanthes, and Chrysippus, the first three leaders of the Stoa, Stoicism was consolidated as one of the main philosophical forces of the ancient world. But its greatest consequences were still to come. Because Stoicism didn't remain restricted to Athens, it spread to the island of Rhodes, where Panaetius would adapt Stoicism for Roman audiences, softening its more radical demands and making it more palatable to practical aristocrats. To Rome, where Posidonius of Apatheia would combine Stoicism with advanced natural science, studying tides, earthquakes, geography, history, showing that Stoic philosophy wasn't just ethics, but a complete worldview. And then something extraordinary happened. Stoicism conquered Rome, not by force, but by relevance. Practical Romans, focused on civic duty, military discipline, and imperial administration, found in Stoicism a philosophy perfectly suited to their needs. The Stoic emphasis on virtue, on self-control, on acceptance of fate, on rational fulfillment of duty. All of this resonated deeply with the Roman character. Cato the Younger became the perfect example of the Roman Stoic, incorruptible, austere, preferring death to living under tyranny. When Julius Caesar won the Civil War, Cato committed suicide in Utica, refusing to accept pardon from a dictator. They tried to save him, stitched his wounds. He tore out the stitches and died. Pure Stoic determination taken to the extreme. In the following centuries, Stoicism would produce some of the most influential thinkers in Roman history. Advisors, freed slaves, even emperors would embrace the philosophy begun by that shipwrecked Phoenician merchant. But Stoicism also influenced something even greater: early Christianity. Paul of Tarsus, educated in Greek philosophy, used Stoic concepts in his letters. The idea of a divine logos becoming flesh in John 1 has evident Stoic roots. Christian ethics of accepting suffering, of not resisting evil with violence, of seeking inner virtue independent of external circumstances. All of this had deep parallels with Stoicism. Church fathers like Clement of Alexandria and Origen studied Stoicism. Augustine was influenced by it before his conversion. The very structure of medieval ethical thought owes much to the Stoic systematization of virtues. When the Roman Empire fell and the classical world collapsed, much of Greek philosophy was lost to the West, but Stoicism survived, partly because it was incorporated into Christian thought, partly because Stoic texts continued to be copied in monasteries. In the Renaissance, Stoicism resurged with force. Montaigne studied it. Erasmus admired it. Justus Lipsius systematically revived it in the 16th century, publishing critical editions and writing treatises on Stoic constancy during the devastating religious wars. In the 17th century, Descartes was influenced by Stoic ethics, even while rejecting its physics. Spinoza developed a philosophical system that, though original, had a fundamentally Stoic structure: deterministic universe, rational order, freedom through adequate understanding. In the 18th century, the American founders, especially Thomas Jefferson, were devoted readers of Stoic texts. The American Revolution was led by men influenced by the Stoic ethics of civic duty and republican virtue. And today, Stoicism is experiencing an extraordinary resurgence. Bestsellers about modern Stoicism sell millions. Athletes, executives, military personnel, cognitive behavioral therapists all apply Stoic principles. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, one of the most effective and scientifically validated forms of psychotherapy, is essentially applied Stoicism. It's not events that disturb us, but our judgments about them. By changing those judgments, we change our emotions. All of this, 2,300 years of continuous philosophical influence, began with a Phoenician merchant who was shipwrecked, lost everything, walked into a bookshop in Athens, and decided to learn how to live. Zeno didn't write texts that survived, only fragments quoted by others. But his life, his example, his school, his system, these traversed empires, religions, revolutions, world wars, reaching you now, discovering a man who transformed a shipwreck into universal wisdom. The philosophy of resilience wasn't born from a sage protected in an ivory tower. It was born from someone who truly lost everything and, even so, found something no one could ever take away: the capacity to choose how to respond to what happens. Zeno died over 2,000 years ago, but if you've ever lost something important, a job, a relationship, an opportunity that seemed to define your future, you know exactly what he felt in that shipwreck. If you've ever lain awake at night worrying about things you can't control, you're wrestling with the same problem Zeno solved at the Stoa Poikile. If you've ever felt paralyzed by anxiety about the future or the weight of the past, you need the same distinction he taught: what depends on you versus what doesn't depend on you. Because the world has changed radically since ancient Athens. We no longer have Roman emperors or ships carrying Tyrian purple. But we have something Zeno would recognize instantly. The fundamental human condition remains identical. We continue facing unexpected losses. We continue dealing with uncertainty. We continue being vulnerable to forces beyond our control. Illnesses, economic crises, betrayals, accidents, the simple unpredictability of life. And we continue making the same mistake that 3rd century BC Athenians made. We try to control the uncontrollable and ignore what's truly in our power. Think about how many hours you've spent worrying about what others think of you. Zeno would say, others' opinions don't depend on you. They're external. They're indifferent to your true good. Why invest emotional energy in that? Think about how many times you've gotten irritated by traffic, bad weather, flight delays, technology that doesn't work. Zeno would ask, does that depend on you? No. So why let it disturb your inner tranquility? Think about how many decisions you've postponed out of fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of losing something. Zeno would remind you, you already lost everything the moment you were born. Because you were born mortal, vulnerable, subject to fortune. Everything you have is temporarily borrowed, including your own body. The only thing truly yours is your capacity to choose virtuously. This isn't abstract philosophy. It's the most practical tool that exists. When you understand the dichotomy of control, you stop wasting energy fighting the inevitable and start investing all your strength in what truly matters: your choices, your values, your actions, your character. When you develop apatheia in the Stoic sense, you don't become insensitive. You become free. Free from being manipulated by external desires. free from panicking when things don't go as planned, free to act rationally even under extreme pressure. When you live in accordance with nature, as Zeno taught, you stop fighting reality and start flowing with it, not passively, but actively, choosing your responses, maintaining your principles, fulfilling your specific role in the cosmos with excellence. High-performance athletes use Stoic principles to maintain focus under pressure. Entrepreneurs apply the dichotomy of control to make decisions in environments of radical uncertainty. Therapists teach patients with anxiety and depression to distinguish between automatic thoughts, which happen, and how they respond to those thoughts, which they can choose. Military personnel in war zones use Stoicism to maintain mental clarity when death can arrive at any second. People dealing with terminal illnesses find dignity and peace applying the same principles Zeno applied when he struck his hand on the ground and said, "I come, I come." It's no coincidence. It's because Zeno didn't invent temporary psychological tricks. He discovered structural truths about the human condition that remain valid regardless of era or culture. You don't need to believe in Zeus. You don't need to accept the Stoic physics of cosmic logos. You can have any religion or none. You can live in any century, in any country. The principles work because they're based on something that doesn't change. You don't control the universe, but you control how you respond to it. You don't choose what happens, but you choose who you are in the face of what happens. And that choice, that small but infinite freedom, is exactly what Zeno found when he lost everything in that shipwreck. He could have despaired. He could have become bitter. He could have spent the rest of his life lamenting his lost fortune. Instead, he realized something revolutionary. The fortune he lost was never truly his. It was just something he possessed temporarily. But his capacity to think, to choose, to live virtuously, that no one could sink in the Mediterranean. And 2,300 years later, that same realization continues saving people from despair. It continues teaching genuine resilience, not the superficial version of be positive or get over it and move on, but the deep version of understand what truly depends on you, invest everything in that, and rationally accept everything else. The philosophy of resilience doesn't promise you'll never suffer. It promises you can choose not to be destroyed by suffering. It doesn't promise you'll always win. It promises you can choose to be virtuous, even in defeat. It doesn't promise constant happiness. It promises deep tranquility based on rational clarity about what truly matters. Zeno started as a merchant. He was shipwrecked. He lost everything, and from that loss, he built one of the most enduring and practical philosophies humanity has ever produced. His story isn't about avoiding shipwrecks. It's about what to do after the ship sinks. And that lesson is as relevant today as it was in ancient Athens. If you could choose just one thing to control completely for the rest of your life, knowing that everything else would be subject to luck, chance, fate, what would you choose?